Well, we are continuing our series entitled Before You Post, and we're dealing with our communication. Certainly our world is filled with technology, and the way we communicate today is not the same as it was a few decades ago. As a matter of fact, much of our communication takes place within the context of emails, text messages, and really any one of the myriad of social media platforms. And so our communication is different, but yet there's foundational issues that need to be addressed with regard to the way that we communicate with others. Whether it's through technology or face-to-face, I believe we have to stop and think about the words that we say, send, or post. And really what we need to be doing is asking ourselves some questions with regard to those things that we put out there for everybody to hear or read. One of those questions that we've looked at is it true? Are the things that I'm saying true? And so we know that the Bible has much to say about honesty and truthfulness, and if our communication isn't true, then nothing else that we say really matters. You know, honesty and truthfulness are the heart of all communication. And so the second question that we've looked at is asking ourselves, is it kind? Now, the concept of kindness is seen throughout Scripture, and communicating with kindness has its foundation in love. So we see passages like 1 Corinthians chapter 13, verse 4, that says, love is patient, love is kind. Now, certainly our love for other people is rooted in God's love for us. And so love, as we know, is the foundation of God's kindness toward us. And so love must serve as the foundation or the basis of our kindness toward other people. And the words that we say or send or post, they must be filled with kindness. And so we have to ask ourselves before we post, is it kind? Now, the next question that we're going to look at is that we need to ask ourselves, is it necessary? Now, you might be wondering, what does the Bible say about words being necessary? Well, it says more than you might suspect. Ecclesiastes chapter 3, verse 7 says that there is a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Proverbs 29, verse 20 says, do you see a man who is hasty in his words? There is more hope for a fool than for him. Proverbs 25, verses 11 and 12 says, a word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in a setting of silver. Like a gold ring or an ornament of gold is a wise reprover to a listening ear. Proverbs 15, verse 23 says, to make an apt answer is a joy to a man, and a word in season, how good it is. Then in the New Testament, James chapter 1, verse 26, there James says, if anyone thinks he is religious and does not bridle his tongue, he deceives his heart, and this person's religion is worthless. Ephesians chapter 4, verse 29, there Paul says, let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear. Or Ephesians chapter 5, verse 4 says, let there be no filthiness, nor foolish talk, nor crude joking, which are out of place, but instead let there be thanksgiving. James chapter 1, verse 19, there James says, know this, my beloved brothers, let every person be quick to hear, slow to speak, slow to anger. And then listen to Jude, verse 3. Beloved, although I was very eager to write to you about our common salvation, I found it necessary to write, appealing to you to contend for the faith that was once for all delivered to the saints. Now, the question is, should we say something or refrain from saying something? That's the question that we're asking. Ecclesiastes 3 verse 7, as we saw, it says there that there's a time to keep silence and there's a time to speak. Well, that means that we have a decision to make when it comes to our communication. Do I say something or not? That's the question. That's the decision that we have to make. You know, Paul sheds a little light on this discussion when he says in Ephesians 4, verse 29, "Let no corrupting talk come out of your mouths, but only such as is good for building up, as fits the occasion, that it may give grace to those who hear." So, think in terms of this way. If the other person needs to hear something and I can communicate it in a wholesome and uplifting way, then it is necessary to communicate. But I want you to think about a couple of other things as well. If something is untrue or unkind, we should not communicate it. And so the question would come, well, when is it ever necessary to communicate or say something that is untrue or something that is mean? My grandmother used to say to me, if you can't say something nice, don't say anything at all. And those are very wise words. And considering our discussion about our communication, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? I need to make sure that the things that I'm saying are true, the things that I'm saying are kind. And there's never a time where it is necessary to say something that is untrue. There's never a time where it's necessary to say something mean. And so we need to make sure that we're asking ourselves the question, is it necessary? Think about it this way. If someone needs to hear the truth and we can communicate it in a kind way, then certainly we should communicate it. If something needs to be said, but it's not the right time to say it, then we should keep that communication to ourselves until the appropriate time comes. A basic rule that I've heard my father-in-law say is, you know, when you have any doubt about whether or not you need to say something, wait 24 hours. Or if you're upset about something, or if you're not yourself, wait a day and then come back to it. Certainly, those are very wise words to follow. Thinking in terms of asking ourselves about things that need to be said and when the time is right to say it. We need to make sure that we're not saying something that may very well be true, something that we're intending to be kind to another person, but saying it at the wrong time. So there's a lot of factors that come into play with regard to this particular question of, is it necessary? Another question that would come is, you know, why should we ask ourselves if we're about to communicate something that's necessary or not? Why should we ask that? Well, Jesus has something to say about this that really ought to cause us to stop and consider those words that we say or send or post. It's Matthew chapter 12, verse 34, where Jesus says, "For out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks." So in other words, what Jesus is saying is that the mouth speaks out of that which fills the heart. Okay? So in thinking about the things that we say, whether or not they're true or whether they're kind or even whether they're necessary, it's important to see what Jesus goes on to say in Matthew chapter 12. It's verses 36 and 37 where Jesus says, "I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak, for by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned." Think about that again. On the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word that they speak. Now, someone once said that careless words come out of an uncaring heart. So certainly in the context of, is it kind? Well, is what I'm going to say coming out of a caring heart or an uncaring heart? Careless words come from an uncaring heart. You know, in keeping with the thought of the golden rule, you know, we ought to ask ourselves, is what I'm about to communicate, is how I'm about to communicate, what and how I would want others to communicate to me. And so when we ask ourselves that question, I think we have to dig deep into really our motive for what it is that we're going to say. And so we ask those questions of, is it true? Is it kind? Is it necessary? And so is what I'm going to say and how I'm going to say it the way or the things that I would want someone to say to me? Those are real questions that I think we need to address. And so I want to ask the question, why do we communicate things that are unnecessary? There's a lot of times that we do communicate what's unnecessary. Sometimes we're like Peter. We get a little bit nervous, so we just simply start sharing words through whatever medium that may be. We may not even stop to think about the things that we're sharing or communicating. We're like Peter, we're nervous, and so our only response to that is just to simply start spewing out words, whether we're saying them or whether we're typing them. Sometimes we just want to make ourselves feel better, and so we say things that'll make us look good to other people so that they will praise us. Sometimes it's about justification. We tell half-truths, we tell skewed versions of the truth to relieve any sense of guilt that we may feel. Sometimes we're just trying to help because we feel like that's what we ought to do. And so we share some kind of encouraging word with someone else when all they really need is for us to just be present with them in the moment. Sometimes we just want to be the first to share information, even if it's not our place to communicate. Communicating what is unnecessary is always about me. It has its foundation in selfishness. And so the next question then to ask is, why should we communicate what is necessary? I believe we should communicate what's necessary out of a desire to follow the example of Jesus. Over and over in his ministry, we see Jesus communicating what is true and what is kind and what is necessary in the moment. And he does it clearly. And we can see it throughout his ministry. And if we're going to follow him, then we need to see those communications that Jesus has, the interactions that Jesus has with other people. And we need to make sure that we're striving to follow that to the best of our ability. I think also we should communicate what is necessary out of love and respect for other people. That's what we see demonstrated in the life of Jesus. But then we should also communicate what's necessary out of an understanding of the importance of our communication. And so in respect to communicating what is true and what is kind, what is necessary really doesn't seem like that big of a deal when you look at asking those questions, is it true or is it kind? Well, what is necessary seems a little bit less, but I think it's important for us to remember the words of Jesus. It's Matthew chapter 12, verses 36 and 37. I tell you, on the day of judgment, people will give account for every careless word they speak. For by your words you will be justified, and by your words you will be condemned. And so I want to say to all of us, before we speak, before we send, before we post, we need to ask, is it necessary?